All right, welcome to the Week 14 Forum. This week, again, we're talking about the relationship between the president and the judiciary. And I think, probably the bulk of this forum will end up talking about confirmation processes and just how problematic the confirmation process has become. I've always been fascinated by the role that the American Bar Association historically played in the confirmation process. And, if you read the text carefully, it basically says that for quite a while, the ABA had a committee that was set up to deal with this sort of thing. And as the presidents would nominate somebody, that committee would evaluate them and vet them and give a professional sense of that person's fitness to be a federal judge. And that began to become more problematical. And I would argue it began to become more problematical as Republicans began to become more and more committed to placing overtly ideologically oriented, jurists onto the bench. And that, again, that really begins to intensify with the Reagan administration. And then, of course, you get, going into the 2000s, where George W. Bush basically says, I'm not going to consult the ABA. Now, why does this sort of thing happen? And I think it really sort of highlights just how our hyperpartisanship has begun to problematize even institutions like the American Bar Association, because the Bar Association is supposed to be basically ideologically neutral. They represent liberal judges and conservative judges. And of course, what happens though is that, historically, as you get into a more and more liberal regulatory environment, you begin to get more and more liberal lawyers coming out of law schools. And of course, historically, I would argue in the early 20th century, probably a strong majority of lawyers were fairly conservative, ideologically speaking. But the New Deal, going into the civil rights movement, going into the regulatory, flurry of laws that happened beginning in the mid 1960s, increasingly begins to increase the number of, for example, trial lawyers that are now litigating on behalf of consumers. And so over time, Republicans increasingly came to the recognition that as an institution, the ABA is now, dominated by ideological liberals. And so their argument was, well, our guys don't get a fair shake. So we're going to create a parallel institution. And now they have this group called the Federalist Society. And of course, now it's reached a point with Trump where effectively the Federalist Society has named his judges. And there's a particular guy within the Federalist Society named Leonard Leo that is effectively, making these decisions. And that's, to me, really, I think it's very interesting that this sort of thing is happening. Overall, how has hyperpartisanship influenced the nomination process? And when did this sort of thing really begin happening? And of course, the first time, recently we the whole instance with Merrick Garland, but that wasn't the first time that the Senate refused to confirm, a sitting president's, judge. Of course, the most recent time that again really kind of begins this push towards more and more partisan, process with confirmations, was when Lyndon Johnson nominated Abe Fortas to replace Earl Warren as Chief Justice. Of course, Fortas was already on the court, but everybody knew that Fortas was very, very close to Johnson. And there were ethical issues with Fortas. And of course, the result was Fortas's attempt to be named to the court was undermined and defeated. And of course, it was Nixon that ended up, being able to replace him and replaced him with Warren Burger, a much more conservative justice. So when does really all this stuff hit a head? Obviously, the Bork nomination and the Clarence Thomas nominations that happened fairly close to one another, and that really kind of just introduced some toxic elements of just deep partisanship. To the point where now Republicans are just saying, if we've got the votes, we're going to put whoever in we want. We're going to put in the most conservative justices that we can. Now, to me, again, the interesting thing is that Democrats, Clinton and Obama, have really not tended to follow suit. They have tended to nominate, people that are well within the mainstream. And again, I would argue, for example, Clarence Thomas is nowhere near the judicial mainstream as it relates to jurisprudence. I mean, this is a guy who would basically unwind uh, every precedent in American, jurisprudence related to, uh, you know, criminal convicts' rights and women's rights and everything else. It's shocking to me, when we read Clarence Thomas's opinions, just how antagonistic he is to the existing precedent, to the stare decisis elements of American jurisprudence as it relates to regulatory policy too, for example. So um, obviously, I think this is an important issue, and I think there's a lot of things, a lot of other issues to talk about. But I imagine most of you will probably be more interested in this confirmation process because it's got a human element to it, and we understand and become outraged by the injustices and involved in some of this stuff. And God, mean Democratic senators made Samuel Alito's wife cry and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, there's a lot of drama in this stuff. But it's really important. Again, if you put people on the court that have already made their minds up, then you're not going to get good law on either side. And again, it could go in either direction. But we have a real problem in terms of how we're doing this, and right now, and I think something needs to be done. And I don't know what it is, to be honest. So anyway, I hope we have a good week of discussion.